Early plans and designs for the next generation Xbox and PlayStation 6 are underway, with Sony and Microsoft speaking a lot to developers to figure out what their plans should be and what developers will want from next generation hardware. There have been a lot of interesting movements, of course, in the industry over the past several months. Tom Henderson, as well as myself, have spoken a lot about the PlayStation 5 Pro, which is likely to launch at some point late next year. Microsoft themselves leaked a ton of details of their console refresh plan as well as their next generation, although I do think some of the plans for that have changed, and we'll talk about that in this video. Nintendo's new console is on the horizon and looks set to launch next year. Again, I've leaked a lot of details concerning that, but it looks fairly impressive, at least compared to the Switch hardware, which, yeah, it's still going to be behind, let's say, the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, but will be a tangible upgrade and will leverage technologies like Nvidia's DLSS. But what about the PS6 and next generation Xbox? How will they differ from one another? Well, as you probably gathered, in this video I want to talk to you guys about that, because not only will their general strategies change, of course, going into the next generation, but also a lot of the fundamental principles on how both console manufacturers will be designing their respective hardware will also seem to change quite significantly as well. And we're going to get right into all of that. This is a paid partnership with BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a fantastic platform which offers 100% online therapy, making therapy way more accessible. Seeking therapy can be scary, but many people do need someone to talk to, and for those folks, sometimes therapy is the best option. Life can be tough, but we can learn to approach it a different way, and with therapy you can be given the tools you need to make positive changes to your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a difficult situation you're dealing with, such as anxiety or depression, to benefit from therapy. Sometimes just daily struggles can leave you wanting someone to talk to. As I said previously, BetterHelp is 100% online, and by answering just a few short questions, their platform matches you with a credentialed therapist in just a few short days. Click the link in our description to get started. Not only does it help support our channel, but it allows you to get 10% off of your first month of therapy. And do not worry, if your matched therapist isn't right for you, you can switch at no additional cost to yourself. Take charge of your mental health. Therapy can be life-changing, and getting the help you need can be freeing. They have specialists for specific issues such as stress, anxiety, depression, trauma, and more to help you. Don't be afraid to reach out. Again, you can click the link in the video description or go to betterhelp.com/redgaming. That is betterhelp.com/redgaming for 10% off of your first month of therapy. I want to start out with Xbox first, because Microsoft managed to basically kick its own shin pretty heavily. Accidentally, it leaked a ton of unredacted documents. This, of course, is in their current goal of purchasing Activision Blizzard. There have been a lot of golden nuggets buried amongst the 38 terabytes of data. That's a lot of information. Who knows what other interesting discoveries, though, are left for those willing to comb through all of that info. Chiefly grabbing headlines, however, included some internal communications, potential studio and publisher acquisitions, for example Capcom and Nintendo, alongside an Xbox Series X and S refresh. The Series X refresh, known as Brooklyn, we'll focus on for a second. It had a number of technical changes, improvements to Bluetooth and wireless technology, a shift to 6nm manufacturing process for its APU, but it was also touted as adorably all digital. This was a term that I actually had kind of an issue with. I found it quite an annoying statement, because on one hand Microsoft talk a lot about game preservation, but while I think the company has done quite a lot for that, this would kind of kill it, particularly if you had a large back catalogue of Xbox One titles, for example. It remains unknown though whether these plans have changed, and we'll get more into that in a second, because there's also Series S, known as Elwood. Now, from what the slides are stating, both Brooklyn and Elwood, in terms of their raw capabilities, CPU, GPU, etc., they remain identical to the current consoles. The company therefore is not taking the same approach we saw with the Xbox One S refresh. With the previous generation, with the S, Microsoft ramped the clock frequency of the GPU up to from 853 to 914 MHz, and this of course in turn cranked performance metrics of the console such as T-flops, fill rate, and ESRAM performance, as it was directly tied to the GPU frequency. Now recently Microsoft did launch a larger capacity Series S console. It had 1 terabyte, but this doesn't seem to be the same device that is being hinted here with the Elwood refresh. Power consumption figures for this new console that has been launched remain identical, but we also don't have the newfangled wireless technology either. Now, Phil Spencer himself has stated that plans have changed, many of them anyway, and I'm inclined to believe that this variant of the refresh of these consoles is probably dead. I also wouldn't be surprised if a lot of their next generation plans have also changed too. We'll get more into that in a second. From what I understand, a new APU variant of the current machines hasn't been worked on, i.e. a die shrink, but it doesn't mean much. I mean, this information is deliberately NDA, so you don't hear about everything, just the nature of the beast. Now, Phil Spencer has also stated in the past, prior to the document leaks, that there's no Pro variant for the Xbox Series X console. The document leak also reinforces this. There was no mention about it whatsoever. And again, this is a further departure to what we saw with the strategy from the previous generation about the Xbox One S and X. I believe it's likely Microsoft isn't lying or sandbagging. I've already leaked a cancelled Xbox Sabin prototype. You can check it out on the channel. You can type in Xbox Sabin, that's S-A-B-I-N. It's essentially a souped-up Xbox Series S. It has considerably more performance though, RAM, but also, most interestingly, machine learning. It never got off the ground. I basically was told through the grapevine that the project was canned super early. It was during kind of pitch and concept stages, but my understanding was that Microsoft's R&D is now basically devoted to next-generation hardware. So let's focus on that, shall we, the next-gen stuff, because a few things do stand out. The first of which is that the documents make it clear that as of the time that they were created, decisions were still being made. Now, from what I understand, this was floating around online, so this is not my information, the documents are roughly 12 months old. This is an eternity in technology in the gaming industry, but in these documents, Microsoft were weighing up ARM64 based CPUs versus an x86 design, and also deciding what the configuration is between big and little based CPU. Now, basically speaking, big cores are just that, higher performance cores, and little cores are, well, just, again, the same thing. They are designed to operate at lower power consumption figures, and we're starting to see the shift, for example, in laptops, but also I think also desktops to these type of configurations. Intel have done it, of course, with their 12th and 13th generation processors, and the 14th generation. The 15th generation with Raptor Lake isn't going to be changing things at all. The 15th generation from Intel with Arrow Lake isn't going to be changing too much either, with big/little. But for AMD, things are very different to what we see with like ARM and also Intel. The big cores are standard Ryzen desktop, so whether that's Zen 2, Zen 3, etc. But Little has the same basic architecture of their big cousin. Therefore, they are AMD Zen x86 ISA compatible, basically speaking. However, the design itself is packed tighter together, and that's being very simple with terms, but there are cuts in cache, and the denser design allows the same instruction set to run, but at lower clock frequencies, and they use less power. Now, we've seen AMD employ denser cores in a number of products, including some server chips. Now, you can see on screen some Zen 4C stuff, but this is going to be the same principle we see parroted with future AMD designs as well, like Zen 5 and Zen 6, which of course is more applicable to the next generation Xbox. Microsoft say with these slides anyway that they are looking at Zen 6 as a potential. From my own leak, Zen 5, and as well as general discussions online, it seems Zen 5 is launching some point in 2024, Q2 seems likely. To my understanding, Zen 6 falls late 2025 to early 2026. I think Zen 6 launching in late 25 is more likely. The GPU technology seems still based upon AMD as well. Microsoft essentially are contemplating how much custom work they want to incorporate inside the GPU. Another area Microsoft were debating here is ML Silicon and how much space on a chip it would dedicate to specific MPU tech. Basically, this is dedicated space on the chip, because, well, chips can only be X amount of space, because the larger they are, the more they cost. So, and obviously there are other concessions as well, like power consumption and so on. But basically speaking, the more space you dedicate to, let's say, ML in a specific die space, the less space you have for general other purpose stuff, like, for example, GPU technology. I am simplifying things a lot here, but that's the general gist of things. Now, from what I was told, Xbox Sabin did have some type of ML chip, but it was quite interesting because Microsoft seemed to have designed a lot of the chip itself, from what I was told. AMD did help some, but this upscaling was apparently much better than what FSR2 could run, because that's what this chip did, basically. It was kind of like an upscaler, although it seemed to have other capabilities as well. The upscaling didn't require any input from developers. It was basically run internally and didn't need to be specifically programmed for. For the Xbox Series S and X, there is none dedicated machine learning chip or silicon present. The console, of course, can run machine learning. Microsoft made a big deal of this, but same thing for the PS5. With the Xbox, though, they detailed it a lot better. And it can run things like lower precision operations in the GPU, for example, 8-bit. In very simplified terms, a single precision floating point operation, FP32, can basically run on one shader at once. So one shader runs one operation. FP16 can have 2 operations, 8-bit 4 operations on the same shader, etc, etc. It doesn't always work like that, but as a very simplified explanation when it comes to floating point operations anyway. That'll do. Desktop RDNA 2 is the same, and of course RDNA 3 also do not have dedicated ML capabilities either, again for the desktop. Instead, it uses WMMA. RDNA 3 did make some changes, additional instructions, that type of thing, to make this faster, but it still leverages the same shaders as general purpose workloads. So, for example, the Xbox Series X has 12 T-flops of GPU performance, so any machine learning that's being done would be part of that. It's not a separate thing. RDNA 4, from what I'm told, is launching Q3 2024, and that seems to match up with what others in the industry are saying as well. WMMA, however, is still going to be present here because there's no machine learning chips again for desktop, but WMMA is going to shift to V2, which has some improvements. Again, I've leaked those. RDNA 5 launches 6 quarters later, so that's some point late 2025, because AMD essentially have put most of its R&D now for the desktop on high-end RDNA 5 parts, because high-end RDNA 4 is canned. So then, to cut a long story short, from multiple sources, Xbox does seem to have changed its plans. It was with an initial launch phase of 2027 or 2028. And now I'm hearing it could be earlier, 1 to 2 years. Kepler L2 on Twitter has also said very similar things, and I'm hearing it from multiple sources, not just 1 or 2, but from multiple things. Now, how this impacts things just isn't clear, because Microsoft seem to not want to compromise on some elements. They are making a really big deal of ML-based super resolution, next generation DXR, and also micro polygonal rendering. Now, RTX 40 is already released for the desktop on PC. It's going to launch RTX 50 maybe in the next, within 18 months, basically. RTX 40 already incorporates a lot of this stuff that Microsoft are talking about here, though, of course, Microsoft will likely tweak it a little bit. RDNA 5 could possibly fit the bill with some significant improvements to ray tracing, and it would probably be ready in the kind of time frame Microsoft needs. I've heard that there's a big uptick in RT performance versus RDNA 4. I would be shocked, though, if Microsoft does not double down on machine learning and AI, especially because they focus so much of them on these leaked slides, and also it just makes sense with the company's R&D plus the Sabin prototype, which I'm very confident existed. Also, I would imagine it would have some type of frame generation technology. Microsoft already implied it's part of the vision here, and we've already got FSR3 from AMD for frame generation. I suspect it's going to be much better. The chip I was told about essentially has Zen 5 and RDNA 5, but graphics IP means very little for consoles, because Microsoft could take a hybrid approach between RDNA 4, RDNA 5. They could have a hybrid approach between RDNA 5 and RDNA 6, and that's to say nothing of custom stuff. My guess is it's probably RDNA 5 with custom work. Zen 5 seems quite far along in design. Remember, console APUs take a long time. I've actually heard from a couple of people that Microsoft basically paused, or AMD, or a combination of both, because Microsoft will work with semi-custom teams at AMD. I heard they paused the design of the chip for several months. I had different time frames, like 7, 8 months, a year. I honestly don't know what the true figure is, but what the reason was is just not clear. I've heard it could be packaging technologies, perhaps some type of chiplet or stacked die, which is not really surprising. We've kind of already seen that with RDNA 3 for the desktop, and RDNA 4, the high-end ones which are canned, was going to go with a very interesting stacked die stuff, which I've spoken about in videos before. And RDNA 5 is definitely going that route, assuming AMD doesn't delay it again. Or it could just simply be IPs weren't far along enough in development, and they basically just had to pause something while it was getting ready. Sony dealt with that a lot with the bring up of the PS5, because it started development before the Xbox did. That's one of the reasons Sony ended up having to do a lot of custom crap on the PS5. Plus the fact that they just felt it was a better direction for their console, and Microsoft could have done the same thing. Maybe it wasn't AMD IPs they were waiting for, but for their own internal teams to say, yup, this is what we're doing. Who knows? But anyway, generally speaking, I've heard that Microsoft's strategy is to go with a console which is not going to cost the earth. It's going to be a significant uptick in performance against the Series X, but they want to launch prior to Sony. Going into the next generation though, there are also some questions regarding will Microsoft continue a dual SKU strategy. With of course the Xbox series of consoles, we had the Series S as well as X. While the Series S has been very interesting in terms of sales figures for Microsoft, it has also received a lot of criticisms, particularly from developers in terms of the quantity of memory. Will Microsoft continue this dual strategy moving into the next generation, or instead will they employ a single SKU strategy, but also leverage things like xCloud? There have been some interesting kind of hints that this might be the case in the slides that have been leaked, but again, how accurate those are now remains questionable. Whether we're talking about some kind of light handheld device, but again, whether that's applicable now, it's really unknown, and it's going to be very interesting to see if there are two Xbox SKUs moving into the next generation, what the differences are. My suspicion, and again, I'm not 100% on this, is that Microsoft would have closer parity, for example, in the quantity of RAM, but instead just reduce the compute capabilities. It'll be interesting, though, to see whether that's the case. So what about the PlayStation 6 then? Well, things get a lot more complicated, because unlike Microsoft, who have all but said that there is no Pro console incoming, Sony, of course, we know, almost certainly will release the PlayStation 5 Pro. About 18-19 months ago now, I think it was around March-ish, I first started to leak a lot of the details and plans for the PS5 Pro. At that point, the specifications were somewhat up in the air, but the general strategy that Sony would be using, I leaked. Since then, Tom Henderson has basically reported that there are 30 workgroup processors that will be inside the console, and the memory will be running at 18 Gbps. Since then, in a more recent video, I basically confirmed some of the aspects of the hardware, although I stress, of course, this may change before release, but it seems that the CPU is going to be based on Zen 2, 8 cores again, but running at higher clock frequencies, 30 workgroup processors seems to be true, and yes, the memory speed was also right, however, it's running in a 256-bit memory bus, so very similar to the PS5, albeit just at faster speeds. I've also heard a lot of mixed things regarding the GPU's IP. It seems based largely on RDNA 3, but it also might have some stuff for RDNA 3.5, kind of more like Strix Point for the desktop, but also maybe even some elements of RDNA 2 for backwards compatibility. Honestly, I've heard a lot of mixed things, and again, with console IPs, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference anyway, because some stuff is just going to be tweaked and adjusted depending what Sony, Microsoft or whomever require. What is important for this video though is that the PS5 Pro will launch late 2024, at least according to Tom Henderson, and my sources have largely said the same thing. I've spoken to some sources and they still haven't, however, actually been NDA'd. Most of it is just whispers. Now, I haven't heard anything from first-party studios, so for example, from Naughty Dog, but the large, the scuttlebutt is that no developer, at least that I've spoken to, has been NDA'd. Now, it's possible they're lying, but generally, if someone's in an NDA and they can't really say anything, they usually just skip the question or don't respond, at least in my personal experience. So the thing is, if this is true and the PS5 Pro does launch late 2024, and it becomes more complicated, of course, because Jim over at Sony has just quit, so maybe something has changed, it means that a PS6 is not going to launch anywhere close to, the PS5 Pro, because, well, it just doesn't make any sense for marketing reasons and just, pissing off your customer base. I've spoken to several people, and from what I'm hearing, late 27 to 28 is when this is going to launch. I say this as well based on a few other criteria. Xbox design started before the PS6, according to multiple people that I'm speaking to. The Xbox design is apparently further along than the PS6, and Sony are still somewhat speaking to developers and deciding stuff for its design. Several people have also told me that Microsoft want to launch first. They did so, of course, with the Xbox 360, and it was kind of a winning strategy for them, to be honest. I mean, Sony really hurt themselves with the PS3, with the pricing. There was a lot of cool stuff in the PS3. The cell processor was really good, but it was also quite difficult to program for. And I think Sony learned a lot of lessons in that generation too. Obviously, one of the issues Microsoft had was the Red Ring of Death. So, yeah, I think that was an interesting generation to see how they kind of were trying to leapfrog one another. So what I'm hearing is that they want a tangible upgrade over the Series X, but Microsoft also do not want a crazy expensive console. So because the PS5 Pro is in development, assuming it doesn't get scrapped, and God knows what's going to happen, especially now, of course, Jim has stepped down from Sony, it makes sense that, the Pro would launch late 2024. So, a PS6 launching in late 25 or early 26 makes no sense. Late 2027, something like that, is much more logical for the PS6. But, let's talk more about the nitty-gritty. What about the actual capabilities? As you guys know, each generation of PlayStation, like any console, has major tech upgrades. Some of this stuff is quite interchangeable between Sony and Microsoft, especially for some of their stuff, which we'll get into in a second. But for example, the PS4 pushed GPU compute, significant upticks in the amount of memory, 512 megabytes up to 8 gigabytes, with OS reserves and stuff, of course, still. The PS5 bought hardware-based ray tracing, as did the Series X, much faster SSD technology. Obviously, Sony made a really big deal of their audio capabilities, etc., etc. But from what I'm hearing, Sony's team seem to have some key that they have for the PS6. And it's not just things like more compute and a faster CPU. There's going to be big improvements in ray tracing. Now, of course, this is logical because ray tracing is not going anywhere. We've already seen some patents from Sony which are likely for the PS5, such as ray shortening. I've covered them on the channel before. From what I understand, RDNA 2 desktop definitely doesn't have these capabilities, and I'm damn sure the PS5 doesn't either, because it's basically RDNA 2 RT, and it looks to me like Sony did some tweaks for the PS5 Pro. Now, whether they actually make it into the PS5 Pro, I don't know. I don't think the patents would be for the PS6. I think they're way too early to publish those patents, but who knows. But there was also another really big thing, and that's an RT reconstruction presentation. Now, this was on an official Sony channel on YouTube. I don't know if it's still present. The original video was geared towards movies, but video games specifically are also mentioned with the PlayStation logo. I've spoken to developers, and yes, they've told me that this is what Sony are doing. NVIDIA have already kind of done this with DLSS 3.5, but this is 2023, 3.5 came out. Now, DLSS 3 has frame generation, which is literally what it says on the tin. It literally generates a new frame of animation using GPU. DLSS 3.5 is RT reconstruction. RTS, that actually works on older NVIDIA GPUs like RTX 30, whereas frame generation is specific to the RTX 40 series of cards. When the PS6 comes out, though, I suspect software and hardware would have moved on significantly, and I don't think it's very inconceivable that while we won't get full path tracing in games, massive RT improvements will be possible. Basically what happens with DLSS 3.5, and from what Sony are kind of stating here, is that you need fewer rays, and it can reconstruct a much better looking visual image than what would be. So from what the conference is essentially saying, that they're using fewer numbers of rays to basically figure out what is going on in the image, and then they're using ML and machine learning and AI to basically up sample the quality. Now that's really simplified. I've gone much deeper into this before, but I don't want to spend like 5 minutes recounting what I've already said in the video. But you can kind of get, in other videos, but you can kind of get an idea of what's going on anyway with the visuals here. Now to do this type of reconstruction, it's likely, I think, Sony will push similar NPU technology to what Microsoft are leveraging. Again, whether this is a ground-up design or whether it's some type of future AMD-based technology, it's kind of hard to know. I would say that it's possible a combination of both. I was also told Sony, and this is quite interesting, are speaking to developers about pushing advanced physics simulation capabilities to the PlayStation 6. Now, of course, physics in video games have been present for a long time. I mean, there's a reason, for example, that if you, shoot an enemy in a game, they, fall to the floor and they don't just, do nothing. So AI, of course, is also the same thing. If you do something in a video game, obviously an NPC is going to respond in one way or the other. However, we're talking about advanced stuff here, and they want to basically give developers freedom and flexibility. Now, it's very early to know the exact scope of this, but there's a lot of potential for very impressive and immersive technology. NVIDIA have actually showed off on their official YouTube channel a ramen shop demo. I think the character's name was Jin, but it doesn't matter too much. It basically uses generative AI along with advanced visuals and DLSS to create very realistic and interactive looking simulations. You basically can check this full thing out yourself on their channel. The technology is still really proof of concept, but in theory you can essentially talk, as in have a conversation with the character. So for example, let's say that your name is Bob and you're talking to Jin here. You can say, "Hey there Jin, how's it going? My name's Bob. Do you guys have X ramen?" And he'll respond, and you can be like, "Hey, also I've heard there's like a gang around here that are selling illegal chocolate bars. Do you know where they are?" That kind of thing. I mean, obviously, the conversation would be a lot more interesting, but this is the kind of thing that I think games developers were going to eventually push to. And how extensive this is in the PlayStation 6, who knows? So yeah, it does seem that Sony's plan, at least right now, is to not really care so much when Microsoft are launching their console. I've heard that despite the fact that Sony seem to be predicting that they're going to launch up to 18-ish months later, they don't really seem too concerned, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Obviously, Microsoft launched the Xbox 360 way before the PS3, but you could say that Sony also somewhat shot itself in the foot. Now, from what I'm hearing, and obviously at the end of the day, we'll have to wait and see how much Sony want to subsidize the cost of the hardware for the PS6, it seems that the bill of materials for the PlayStation 6 is possibly going to be more expensive by a decent chunk. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether this is reflected upon sales figures. Sony are generally thought to be the market leader, at least how they're perceiving themselves. I'm going to be very interested, though, going forward to see what happens with all three companies. The strategy, obviously, since Jim Ryan is leaving, could certainly change. At the end of the day, a lot of this is still up in the air. The PlayStation 6 is still really early in the design / bring up stage, and stuff is certainly not solidified yet. It's mostly just the strategies at this point. I suspect, however, that the next generation is going to bring a lot of very interesting stuff with, for example, generative AI. I think that, you know, each subsequent console generation has brought with it some really cool stuff. And I will be super interested to see what happens with the next generation of gaming. At the end of the day, we've got some really interesting and cool worlds that have been developed right now. For example, Cyberpunk looks quite amazing, even on consoles. But I think, you know, 3, 4, 5 years' time, there are going to be some really interesting things. And it's not just the hardware, but also the, you know, skill and understanding of developers. A lot of this stuff is still quite early in the concept stages. And if you've played around with something like ChatGPT or image generation programs, and you can kind of get an idea of what can happen. It's going to be very interesting moving forward, and that's to say nothing about PC hardware, which is obviously just shooting off into the stratosphere. The rumours for Blackwell, for example, are absolutely bonkers. So my prediction moving into the next generation is it's going to basically take what we know about, let's say, the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series hardware, but it's going to ramp it up significantly. I think both Sony and Microsoft are going to be fully jumping on the machine learning / AI bandwagon. And it's not just going to be for stuff like upsampling, frame generation, more just realistic and interactive characters, physics, better weather, it's just a lot of stuff. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.